Empathy. It's one of the most celebrated virtues in modern life, praised by psychologists, activists, politicians, and parents. We're told to feel what others feel, to walk in their shoes, to lead with empathy. But what if that deeply held belief is actually leading us astray? Our guest today is Dr. Joe Rigney, a pastor and theologian who's made waves with a new controversial argument that empathy, far from being a moral good, is actually a sin. That it clouds judgment, enables manipulation, and at its worst becomes a counterfeit form of compassion. Now, many of you are not religious, and that's okay. The point still stands. Dr. Rigney argues empathy is bad and has caused the woke movement and other social declines in our society. Dr. Rigney teaches theology at New St. Andrew's College and pastors Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He's the author of The Sin of Empathy, Compassion, and Its Counterfeits, a book that doesn't just challenge mainstream psychology, but also takes aim at how empathy is being weaponized in today's culture, religious and secular alike. Dr. Joe Rigney, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
Okay, empathy's bad. Who thinks that? Why do you think empathy is bad? Most of us are told empathy, that's what we should be feeling. That's actually a elevated level of sympathy, right?
Yeah, that's actually part of what got me into this, is that at least in the modern world, empathy is presented as a kind of upgrade on sympathy.
Right.
So the sympathy is the old word. It's the word you'd find in any pick up any translation of the Bible. You're going to find sympathy all over the place. And empathy is a newer word, enters into English in the 20th century, and is presented as upgraded compassion, as a sort of more loving and holistic response. There's a great video, viral video, came out a number of years ago from author Brene Brown, where basically she says, sympathy is aloof, cold, distant, and kind of stays away from, distant from suffering. Whereas empathy is a sacred space that stays out of judgment and goes all in. And that's precisely where my concerns lie. I don't have a problem if people just mean by empathy, we share some emotions. That's human, that's normal, that's great. But my concern is when empathy becomes untethered from reality, when it becomes unanchored from what's true, from what's good, from what's helpful for someone, and the immediate feelings of someone who's hurting sort of drive the show, and all of society needs to be rearranged around that person or that suffering or what have you. And I think anybody who's ever been on the receiving end of a pity party in a family, for example, a guilt trip, like the way that works is a good illustration of what I'm getting at. You have a family member who wants to do something destructive, and someone says no, and then they put on a long face. They play up their martyrdom, and as a result, people give in. People acquiesce to a destructive pattern of behavior. They coddle it, and that would be the sort of thing I would say. That's the sin of empathy, when compassion becomes unmoored from truth and reality and sweeps us off our feet.
Okay, so let's just kind of define the difference between sympathy and empathy. And do you think sympathy is bad?
So at one level, I wouldn't wrangle about the words. So the thing that would be good would be weeping with. The Bible tells us, weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice, be kind, compassionate, tenderhearted. All of these things are virtues. In fact, one of the ways to think about this would be when you think about a virtue like courage. Everybody realizes that could go wrong in one of two ways. You could have too little of it and you would be a coward, or you could have too much of it and you could be reckless. That's when your risk-taking impulse becomes untethered from what's wise and good. I'm saying empathy is the same sort of thing. So sympathy or compassion would be a love for hurting and broken and weak people that tries to help them. Apathy would be too little of it. And I think the way that empathy gets frequently used in the modern world would be the excessive form that becomes untethered from reality. So one of the images that I frequently use is, imagine someone's drowning in quicksand. Apathy stands on the side and lets them just sink, doesn't care. Right. Empathy dives in with both feet, and now you've got two people who are swept off their feet. Compassion or sympathy, the good kind, the virtue, does reach in. It joins them in that suffering, but also remains tethered to something on the side, grabs a big branch in order to actually help them get out.
Yeah.
And I think in the modern world, we've migrated from that virtue to the excessive, untethered form of it that does become a tool of emotional blackmail and manipulation.
Okay, so let's use a real world example to kind of break this down. Let's talk about like the trans issue.
Yes.
I mean, I believe that there are people who are trans. they suffer from a mental illness that causes them to believe that they're in the wrong body. And it's I think I think it's been more rare. I mean, we could, there's a lot of debate on whether or not the current trend is real or not, or if it's like a trend or something along those lines. Or, in my mind, it could be, we are poisoning each other with our food and all kinds of different stuff. So maybe the brains are getting all mixed up. But nonetheless, there's this trans movement, and you've got what would be a sympathetic reaction to somebody who's trans versus the empathetic wrong reaction to somebody who's trans.
Yeah, so I think what compassion would do in the face of someone who genuinely is confused, and maybe they are confused because they've been catechized and indoctrinated into some kind of gender ideology, but nevertheless, the feelings of distress are real. They're there, and they want to do something about it. Compassion would say, this is awful, this is horrible, but we're not. But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to cater to this insanity. We're not going to try to get reality to conform to these deranged feelings. And I think that's precisely what the trans movement has done, is they presented trans people, those with gender dysphoria, as hyper vulnerable, who must be catered to and accommodated. And we've then gone to rearrange our entire society in order to accommodate their derangement. And so now, in the name of compassion, in the name of empathy, we're going to castrate children. We're going to mutilate young girls. We're going to allow biological males to compete in women's sports or to be in women's bathrooms. So everybody else now has to accommodate this derangement. And what's used to justify this is this so-called virtue of empathy. To fail to do that, to resist that insanity, to resist that derangement, would be to be callous and heartless and cruel. And my argument is, no, compassion says we don't leave people in their derangements. We don't cater or accommodate them. We remain tethered to what's true and what's right, not only for that person, but for the rest of the people who would suffer if we allow men to compete in women's sports, for example. So that is a really good example. And I think it's the latest in a long train of ideological movements that have sought to reorganize society, break down the family, justify great evil, and have done so in the name of so-called empathy, in the name of this untethered kind of compassion.
So give us an example, a theological example, a biblical example of, because you say it's a sin and you're a pastor. So how do you say, what makes you say it's a sin?
Yeah. So all passions, all emotions could be good or bad depending. And everybody sort of recognizes this. If I were to talk about the sin of anger, I think everybody recognizes that could be sin. But you could also recognize a kind of righteous anger, a holy anger, or fear. Fear could be holy or unholy, depending, right? What are you fearing and why? The challenge is that most of us don't think about a virtue like compassion that way. And that's precisely why it can be so destructive, because it goes unrecognized. One of the thinkers that I've really been influenced by on this issue is C.S. Lewis, who regularly talked about the way that virtues like love, like maternal love, who could be against maternal love? A mother's love, that's one of the highest and holiest things, isn't it? Well, it is, unless it becomes ungoverned. If it sets itself up as God, then it becomes, according to Lewis, it becomes a demon. And what I've basically done is taken that same kind of paradigm where the best things, when they go wrong, become highly destructive. And I've applied it to one of the modern world's key virtues in empathy, and said the love for the weak and the hurting does become this kind of tool of emotional manipulation. So a biblical example is in the book of Job. Actually illustrates this pretty well. So Job, you remember the story. He's a great man. He's got 10 kids. Everything's going great. And then God allows the devil to have at him. And the devil steals all his stuff, inspires, these raiders to take all his things. And then his kids are killed in a freak accident. A great wind knocks down a house and all of his children die. And then he's afflicted with boils and scabs and all sorts of sickness. At his lowest point, his wife, who you remember has just lost 10 children, comes to him and says, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Are you still trusting in your God? Curse God and die. Now, in that moment, I think that the modern therapeutic virtue of empathy would say, yeah, you need to hear her pain and affirm it, validate her feelings. She's suffering, and so validate that emotion, that anger that's coming from grief needs to be shared and validated. And instead, Job says, you're speaking foolishly, right? Should we not accept evil from God as well as good? Like God is God, and I'm going to continue to trust him. And so one of the differences, I think, between the virtue of compassion and the sin of empathy is that compassion always reserves the right not to blaspheme, not to lie, not to say things that are false in order to appease those who are being steered and governed by their passions. So that's really the issue. Is pity or sympathy or compassion, whatever word you use, was meant to kind of spur us to help those who are in misery, but it becomes this tool of manipulation when it becomes like an emotional blackmail. You don't love me if you don't validate, affirm my identity. If you don't go along with what I want to do, then you don't love me. And people are very susceptible to that because we want to be kind and tenderhearted. We want to love people. And so because of that, we're very susceptible to that kind of blackmail.
Really good illustration there, I think. And so empathy is like with the trans movement is this kind of, okay, I'm joining in with you. So empathy is trying to feel it and be there with the person rather than just having sympathy and feeling bad and saying, oh, gee, that's a terrible thing you're going through. Instead, we're going to go through it together. And so with the trans issue being a good example, I'm not picking on the trans people or trans issue exactly, but it's a great one for the example. But saying, yeah, okay, you're right, you're a woman, and you're right, we're going to give you all these awards and make you the woman of the year, and we're going to let you share the bathroom, we're going to let you compete against the women, we're going to do this whole, we're going to reframe everybody and everything. So we are joining in now on the delusion. It's not just you who are unfortunately afflicted with this delusion. We're going to join the delusion with you because that's the empathetic response. Versus the compassionate response, which would be, that's a really terrible thing you're suffering from, and we should get you help.
Correct. Exactly. We're actually going to try to, instead of trying to adjust all of society and your biological constitution to these deranged feelings, we're going to try to adjust the feelings. We're going to try to bring feelings back in accordance with reality. Like your feelings need to be governed. They need to be guided and not simply be allowed to steer the show. Another example, if you're thinking of another political example in our culture, is the way that on the issue of immigration, I think you see this kind of emotional blackmail come into play pretty frequently, in which people are suffering around the world, they're refugees, and therefore we're not allowed to have borders. In fact, I had a friend send me a picture the other day from the Mexico side of the border, and on the big border wall was written in big block graffiti letters the word empathy. And I thought that was actually a really good illustration of precisely what I'm getting at, because the artist there is saying that this wall is callous and unempathetic. So what does empathy mean? Empathy means you're not allowed to have a border. Empathy means you can have no boundaries, which again is a good illustration of what's demanded when someone, say, throws a pity party for you. They're suffering and they say, you need to join me in these feelings. And if you refuse at all, if you maintain any kind of emotional distance, if you stay tethered to the side, if you won't just join me and affirm me and validate me all the way, then you don't love me. Psychologists talk about this and they get technical and talk about enmeshment and codependence when we're just sort of enmeshed with other people. But nobody goes around saying, I think I'm going to be enmeshed today. Instead, what they say is, I'm going to go be empathetic.
So with immigration, okay. I'm the wall. So saying, well, we're not going to even address the issue. It's these people, we're going to let them just come in, do whatever, because that's the empathetic response. Okay. So I understand that. BLM, and the movement that happened there, how would you say the empathy went awry?
Yeah. So there, I think all things woke over the last decade or so is a really good example of the way that compassion jumped the rails. Because the idea was, here are certain victim classes, oppressed classes, and everybody is carved up into one or the other. So certain demographic traits mean you're in the oppressed class. Certain demographic traits mean you're in the oppressor class. And people discovered that if you were a victim, if you were in the oppressed class, then that victimhood conferred invulnerability. You now can't be challenged, questioned. In fact, we're going to reorganize society around your desires. We're going to seek to rectify past wrongs. And in some cases, there actually were evils in the past that needed to be acknowledged, or that could have been acknowledged, and probably were. But instead, it was people realized that this is a very effective steering wheel for society. And so to be a victim meant everybody will reorganize. They now set the agenda for your institution, for your family, for your entire nation. And we have what I affectionately call the victimhood Olympics of the last 10 years, where people competed to see who could be the greatest victim, knowing that the greatest victim would have the greatest power to reorganize society. And I think BLM is a great example that would use great tragedies like the death of George Floyd, for example, which in and of itself was a great human tragedy. Okay. But that became a totem of a certain narrative that was then used to justify all manner of DEI policies and the instant. We're going to reorganize everything. We're going to upend that pyramid of oppression in order to right this wrong. And that's a really good another illustration of the way that, in this case, the left figured out that our compassion was a very potent steering wheel to get their way.
Well, and also just this whole idea of defund the police, like we won't even have any police because that was like to a complete extreme. And then suddenly, people are being robbed. There's crime everywhere, and people are like, "No, bring back the police. We need the police." What are you talking about?
Right. In many ways, progressive governance is often built on this, and frequently it's actually misplaced empathy. So it's empathy for criminals, but it's the hidden person that doesn't get seen, the victims of the crime that actually get ignored. And that's true in a whole host of issues, I think.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a lot of illustrations of this on the left that we've pointed out, from trans to BLM to immigration. I'm sure there's many, many more examples of this. Like even COVID, like during COVID, I think there was probably a lot of examples of like everybody needs to lose their livelihoods, everything in order to save a very small group of people that are vulnerable. It was everybody's got to suffer. Everybody's got to give everything. We got to make the children completely suffer, right? And they get no educations, and they're going to become sociopaths because they can't read facial expressions because everyone's wearing masks. So there was a lot of that. I think there's a lot of examples. But do you think that on the right, this has resulted, the over empathetic nature of the left has, on the flip side, created a lack of compassion on the right? Like George Floyd is a good example. Because there's a big debate about how he actually died. Okay, fine, right? Maybe he died of drugs. Maybe he died because he had a knee on his neck. I don't know. But the fact is he died, and that is terrible. That is a tragedy that somebody died. And if they did die from drugs, it's tragic that they were addicted to drugs. It's tragic that they, there's a lot of tragedy there. But instead of there being any, like you said, the apathy aspect of just like, oh, I'm just going to let you fall into the quicksand and that's what you get. I feel like there's a lot of that on the right toward the left. There's a lot of, screw you, you're not human. Like you're just you're the devil, you're demon because you're on the left. And so I just hope you all rot in hell, die, rot in hell, and I don't care. Like there seems to be that, do you see what I'm saying? Like the lack of compassion? The apathy that is developed on the right as a response to the empathy on the left.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd frame it a little differently, because I actually think that the demonization from the left to the right was just as potent. I think that because this is another Lewis quote that he argued that pity, when it's unmoored from justice and charity, leads through a very natural process through anger to cruelty. So pity for an oppressed class leads to great anger and cruelty. There's amazing how many things you can do to your enemies in the name of pity and empathy.
Right.
So I think that and I think COVID would be a great example. Think of the way that people were death shamed if they didn't get the vax and ended up dying, and the sort of celebrations and the good riddance. That's where I heard that more. I think on the right, I think it's certainly possible for people on the right to become overly callous. But I think that oftentimes the political rhetoric is because they recognize the way that a great tragedy is going to be selectively used to set certain agendas. So certain deaths are going to become icons of major narratives that require societal reorganization, like the death of George Floyd. But the death of, say, Austin Metcalf, who died a few days ago at a track meet, a white kid who was killed by a black young man in this, both, again, a great tragedy. Is it going to become the same kind of icon that requires societal reorganization, or Laken Riley, who was killed by an illegal immigrant, right? There's ways in which those narratives, part of what the right is reacting to is the weaponization of this at a political level, or the way that school shootings frequently are done in this way. It's not simply about the tragedy, which is anytime anyone is killed in these circumstances, it is a great tragedy for that family, for that community. And as a pastor, I have all kinds of ways that I would want to meet those needs, suffer, weep with those who weep. All of that would be actually required. But then when we move from the immediate situation to using this as a tool to reshape society, to propose gun laws that wouldn't have even stopped that particular shooting, or to right certain oppressions because of this one event, that's where you're going to see, I think, on the right, an increasing resistance, because they recognize the way that they've been played over the last 20 years on all of these issues. And they've gotten to the point where, as the vice president said, I don't really care, Margaret. Like, so there you can hear kind of that apathy, right? I don't care. But what he's not caring about isn't simply like the immediate suffering of an individual, but it's the way that suffering is trying to be weaponized in order to short circuit rational debate about what would be good and wise.
Well, I think it's all a pendulum that swings back and forth. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I do think that there's obviously a reaction coming from the right, which is justified because the left went so insane. But I think the reason why the left went so insane was because the right lacked apathy. I mean, had a lot of apathy and lacked empathy, or lacked compassion even, for many years towards many groups. And that the shunning, or, the banishment, the shunning, the harassment of certain groups of people, like marginalized groups of people, created a monster on the left that started with compassion and then led to full-on empathy. Which went way overboard. And I'm actually now seeing on the right the same sort of overboard reaction. I think that for a while the reaction was correct and appropriate, but now I'm starting to see an overcorrection. And I see this all the time. It goes back and forth with both sides. So it just swings like a pendulum. It's like the right goes overboard, and then the left goes overboard, and then the right goes overboard. And I just don't know when it's ever going to stop. I'd like to see it stop and everybody kind of level out. But, I'm not really seeing that. I'm curious if you think empathy is ever good.
Yeah, insofar as if empathy just means, as it does for some people, they'll define it as sharing of emotion, right? So if you feel sad, I feel sad. If you feel happy, I feel happy. I think that's a natural human emotion. I think it's it's a part of our basic kind of hardwiring by God's design. And when it then is put in service of someone's ultimate good, like I'm going to share your suffering in order to help you, I think it's a great thing. I think that's what compassion is. And so that natural human emotion sharing can lead to compassionate action. I'm all for that. The fundamental issue is always going to be whether or not it's anchored to what is true, whether it's anchored to reality, whether it's anchored to your ultimate good, or it's simply concerned with your immediate feelings. And every parent knows that there's moments where your kids feel very strongly about something and want something that would be harmful to them. And to indulge them at that point would on the surface seem compassionate, right? Because they'll be happy temporarily, but in the long run is really going to be destructive to them. We all know this as parents. Mm-hmm. But what we've decided is we're going to short circuit that, and we're going to, any resistance to anybody's claims of victimhood here are going to be indulged, even to the point of castrating or mutilating them, as in the case of the trans, or in the case of killing them. I think the abortion issue actually is another great example of the way that empathy can become myopic. Okay. And so frequently you'll see how does the left rhetorically orient on that particular issue. Well, here's a woman who's in distressed circumstances. She's pregnant, and life is going to be really hard for her if she has this baby. In the extreme cases, they're going to actually put forward the baby's the product of rape. She was raped and now she's pregnant. But what should we do there? Well, compassion is absolutely the right response. We should feel great sorrow and grief and join her in that pain. But do we lose sight of the other human being who's now in view? Mm-hmm. Right? And so the left wants to elevate this woman, this mother, as an object of compassion while completely dehumanizing her unborn child. The unborn child can be dispensed with, disposed of, and terminated. And in the name of what? What's the reason that we can do this? Empathy. Empathy for her means we can kill him. And that would be another example of the way it's not tethered to reality. And it actually needs to take into account both her suffering and the baby's life and the baby's rights. Both of those need to be in view as we seek to help them, not just one opposed to the other.
Yeah, I think that debate is a bit more complicated than that. I don't think that's really what the left is thinking. I think the right gets the left wrong all the time. I think there's a lot that the left is doing that the right gets right, but I think they usually get the left wrong and the motivations and the thinkings of the left. And I say this as somebody that grew up in a very religious, right-wing Idaho, and was surrounded. I myself was very religious, and was around a lot of conservative ideas. But I also have been. I'm more of a liberal. I've always been more of a leftist and a liberal, even though I had more of the conservative upbringing around me or whatever. So I can. And I'm also half Asian, half white, which is a similar thing. I understand Asians and I understand white people, and I understand them in a way that other people do not, because I intimately understand. I'm in an Asian family and I'm in a white family, so I see the inner workings of how they operate. And people often get each other wrong on that. Whites will view Asians a certain way, Asians will view white a certain way, and they're both wrong. And I see that with the left and the right. I think that both sides get each other very wrong very often, most of the time, to be quite honest with you. Like just the delusional thinking of what the motivation is of the left and why they're doing something is just not accurate. And these are not conversations liberals are having. It's not on the dinner table at all. And the right will just perceive it in that way. And the same thing goes for the left. The left, I hear it all the time. They'll be like, oh, the right, they're just a bunch of, they're apathy, they have no empathy or compassion. They're just, jerks, and they don't care about people. And, everybody just gets each other so completely wrong when it comes to all of this stuff. And it's exhausting. But that we really, especially from a Christian perspective, should be looking at each other as all children of God, right? Each and every single individual. And that each individual is valuable and loved. And but when it comes to the abortion debate, I don't think that's exactly what the left thinks on that. But I understand that the right thinks that the right is thinking that it's all about empathy for the mother. That's not actually what's happening in that debate. But I think
I'm actually curious. So my claim would be that the left is able to have compassion for the woman and puts her forward as an object of compassion to the world in order to say, hey, we need to protect this woman's rights and this woman's dignity and so forth. And they don't have the same kind of concern, care, or compassion for her unborn child. The unborn child's a non-factor in terms of their compassion.
Sure. On the left, the argument, the discussions that everyday liberals have about this issue is, first and foremost, there is a debate even inside of the left. Second and third term abortions, highly debated amongst the left. That is not something, people on the right just want to think that liberals are willing to abort a kid all the way up to through the third trimester. And that's just categorically false by a long shot. In fact, if you look back at the early times the government shut down, government shutdowns didn't, now we talk about government shutdown all the time because they can't pass a budget. Those didn't actually begin until the 70s, the mid 70s. And the side that kept shutting down the government was Democrats, and they had full run of the government. I mean, they were in charge of all three branches, all three, they had the House, the Senate, and they had the executive, and they still would shut down the government. Now, somebody would say, well, why is that? Because liberals could not agree on the abortion issue with each other. So they have been debating this forever. The first term abortion is something that on the right most agree that, most people, and we're seeing this time and time again as the abortion debate is actually taken up by the voters since Roe v. Wade was overturned. And we're seeing time and time again, even conservative states passing abortions, allowing abortions in the first trimester. That is pretty much categorically agreed upon by both sides. The debate when it comes to second and third trimester with the left, there is a debate even on the right about incest, rape, and mother's life is in danger. Third trimester, that one most liberals do not agree with. Bottom line, they just don't. But there is, but a lot of liberals will take the stance of, but look, it is not my decision. That's between a doctor and a patient. And we have to put the faith in that the doctor's not going to just terminate a healthy baby for no reason just because the woman decided. But we also know women just don't decide to go in through an entire pregnancy and get to the 8th month and say, I've changed my mind. I mean, that's just not that's so insulting to women, to think that women, a mother with our instincts, with our natural maternal instincts that we're born with, that we would suddenly be like, oh yeah, 8 months in, I've decided I want to party and I just want to get rid of this baby. That's like not a real thing that's happening. The only people I know that have ever had to do a late-term abortion were highly religious people. And it was because of a serious, serious issue with the baby, and the baby was in pain in the womb and not going to make it, or the mother's life was legitimately in danger. And those were in Utah, and those are the only instances that I've ever heard of anybody in my life, conservative women, who've had to abort a late-term baby. Conservative women. I've never known a liberal to do it, because a liberal, if they don't want to have the baby, they just terminate it early on in that first trimester. They would not go. Now, I understand that there are circumstances of women that they're on drugs or whatever, and so they're not thinking straight, and they've let it go too long. But liberals are not having this thinking that, well, the debate for me is it's not a life. I personally am, I think, therefore I am. If I'm not thinking, I'm not existing. So if I'm in a vegetative state, pull the plug. Same thing with, the early stages of a feat. It's the first 12 weeks. I just don't think I don't think there's a viable life. I mean, there's not a viable life. So once it gets that point, though, and consciousness is there, I think that a lot of people, pain, consciousness, and whatnot, there's a huge debate. So the thing though is that people on the right kind of thinking that all liberals are this is just how they see the debate. It's just not right. And it's the same thing on the left when they view the right and say, well, the right just doesn't care about people at all and would rather let the woman. I hear this all the time from liberals where they'll say, well, did you hear what's happening? They're just letting women die because they need an abortion and it's life-saving and they just won't do it and they're just letting them die. And it's like, that's not true either. No conservative standing there saying like, die, lady, because this is my, no, that's just not happening on either side. People aren't that crazy on either side.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the fundamental difference there obviously is about whether or not we're going. So it would be a good illustration to say if personhood and rights are about our assessment of your subjective state. So what you just described as, I don't think up until 12 weeks this is a viable life, or that this individual has rights because we can't assess consciousness or something like that. That's a pretty subjective standard. Like, when does consciousness is this great mysterious thing, and so even at the very least, I would say if you thought that way, that you would want to err on the side of caution. Like, hey, let's just not even do it, and that there is kind of this objective moment where a new human life comes into existence at conception, and so that would be the most like logical, scientific, rational place to say like, hey, anything after that. Right, this is a human life, and whose rights and dignity need to be taken into account as we try to navigate really complex circumstances.
Yeah, I can respect that argument because to me it's a logical one. So I respect the logic of that completely. I respect the pro-life argument. So as long as it's logical, and it often is. I mean, some of them are not, but what you're saying is logical to me, and we can disagree on it, but I can respect that argument for sure. And I respect the erring on the side of caution. I just would prefer, if I'm in a vegetative state, to please pull the plug. Do not err on the side of caution. Don't let me rot there for 20 years. I mean, that's what I would prefer. But that's a difference. But to get back to, I think, okay, I want to go to a right wing, I hate to use the term right wing or even woke liberal or whatever, but let's flip it onto the right for a second. We've gone over the lack of, or the too empathetic on the left, but one standout issue right now where the right, I would say, is overly empathetic is the Israel-Palestine issue. And that is manifesting to me as the same sort of woke left is happening on the woke right. And it's because a group of people experienced a Holocaust that we now have to allow them to do anything they want, including massacring other people, because we feel so bad about the Holocaust. We just feel so much empathy for the Holocaust. So the Israel-Palestine issue, to me, is a manifestation. It's when the right flipped it, and the right became the woke side.
Yeah, so I think, American support for Israel has a lot of complex elements that go into it, right? There's some theological elements among certain Christians,
Sure.
Who, dispensationalists tend to have a continued regard for Israel as God's chosen people or something like that. I'm not a dispensationalist. I don't think that's true. I think God's people is the church, the Christian church, and so forth. But that's one element to it. But I do think that this actually is a really good illustration of the larger argument of the book. So Paul Bloom is a secular psychologist who wrote a book about 8 years ago called Against Empathy, the Case for Rational Compassion, making a similar sort of argument that I am, but not from a Christian vantage. One of the things he said that always stuck with me is that when most people think of empathy, they think of kindness. And he said, but I think of war. And the reason is because empathy for our in-group, our people, is part of what prompts great cruelty and hatred towards our enemies. And so when you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, you see, I look at it and I say, there's just way too much empathy going on here. Because empathy, if you're a Palestinian, empathy for your people means you can justify great evils towards Israel. There was a clip right after the October 7th attack a few years ago, where a spokesman from Hamas basically said, we are victims. Everything we do is justified. And I thought that encapsulates the argument. Like, victimhood means that I can do whatever I want, including this assault on Israeli citizens and rape and murder and so forth. But I think that in principle, the same thing can happen precisely the other way. The great evils that have been done to us justify great acts of cruelty against the Palestinian people. I think in principle, both of those. And in fact, when researchers study empathy, one of the things that always surprised them was that they suspected that the people who were most empathetic, or self-described, I'm an empathetic person, would kind of be universally empathetic. And what they actually discovered is that the most empathetic people tended to be the most polarized, tribalistic, because their empathy was targeted at their people and therefore deeply hostile to their perceived enemies. And one of the reasons that I want to commend a kind of sober-minded compassion, a tethered compassion, is because it allows us to do what you said a moment ago, which is to recognize every human being is made in God's image. Every human being, in the womb, out of the womb, Palestinian or Israeli, white, black, male, female, every human being is made in the image of God and therefore has rights, dignity, and ought to be respected. Empathy kind of short circuits that by narrowing our focus to those who are like us or who we regard as particularly oppressed. It focuses there, and therefore we can demonize those that we hate, those that are opposed to our people. And so I think tethering our empathy is actually what enables it to kind of have a more broad-based recognition of the dignity and rights of others.
Interesting. That is what a way to really frame that empathy is like war. I mean, because it is. When I'm thinking back to trans, right, just going through all of the issues, well, then it's like war against those who won't go along. How dare you dead name? How dare you not use my correct pronouns? How dare you, right? It's a war against the others who are unwilling to go along. Same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement. That movement, it was, how dare you? If you're not with us, you're against us. It creates the COVID, right? We see that. And Israel-Palestine is a great example on both sides of the empathy leading to just justifications of war and atrocities. And so that, whereas sympathy and compassion maybe would not lead to, now we're going to just hate everybody who's not with us and on our side. But what's interesting is I see the empathy, I feel like religion actually creates more of the war on this than, because like when you look at the caliphates, or the Crusades back in the day, luckily we don't have those anymore, but now we do have these like Islamic caliphate kind of rising up, which is similar to the Crusades. I mean, don't you think that kind of had that was sort of like now you're against it, you're not with us. Well, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't have empathy at all. Maybe that was just religious insanity. I don't know.
I think originally the Crusades, were launched as kind of defensive wars against Muslim aggression. So I think part of it is that as Islam spread and was spreading at the point of a sword and taking over what had to that point been formerly Christian lands and resulting in various persecution, that European nations sought to retaliate and retake lands that they regarded as part of Christendom. And so there's complicated things. But to your point, I think that any ideology or any religion could in principle be used as a sort of cover for something more deeply human and visceral. Like I'm a Christian, and I believe every human being is fallen, broken, and twisted by nature, right? We were created good, but we're fallen, we're sinful, which
Sure.
means take any good thing and we can twist it. And so that could be false religion like Islam. It could be true religion like Christianity. In principle, all of those things could be twisted, but it also could apply just as easily if you think in terms of how religion fuels it. The 20th century witnessed mass murder on a massive scale by atheistic and totalitarian regimes that did so, again, in the name of whether it was justice for the oppressed classes, which again has its own kind of empathetic underpinning, or our blood and soil, our type of people with the Nazis or something like that. All of these are examples where you had these deeply visceral, emotional things happening that were then justified and rationalized by various ideologies. And I think that there's no ideology, there's no ideological protection against this kind of hijacking. The only protection, in my view, is you have to anchor your emotions, good, bad, and ugly. You have to anchor all your emotions to something sturdy and true. And as a Christian, it's obvious what that is. It's anchor it to God, anchor it to Christ, anchor it to his world and his reality. That's where you should anchor it. And then when your feelings are obedient, then they're doing what they should do.
Yeah. Okay, so what does this result in? So let's say I think that I agree with you. After hearing your argument, I think that you've made a strong case that empathy is a problem. That in fact we should have compassion and sympathy, but empathy is going too far. This whole I'll join you and we'll just join in on the delusion and share it together and do all these terrible things. So what should we do? Are we now going to go to war on empathy? What's the messaging going forward to get people to stop this? What do we do?
Yeah. So my argument is you can't solve a problem that you don't even recognize. And so part of the reason for writing a book with the provocative title, The Sin of Empathy, there would have been safer titles. There would have been ways that would have been less provocative, that would have required less explanation. But the point of the provocative title was intended to get people to think. So in some cases, it's provoke thought. And in other cases, it's to provoke a reaction to illustrate the point. And so some of the reactions to the book have actually been some of its greatest advertising. As people's emotions get the best of them, they light their hair on fire. And I go, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Emotions in our highly anxious and reactive society, emotions course through the body politic, and we herd and we run to the left, and we herd and we run to the light, and you stampede because everything's driven by emotion. My argument is that's one of the fundamental underlying problems of Western civilization at the current moment. And that the answer, quite frankly, is Christ. The answer is you need to tether your compassion to Christ, as his was. He was a merciful and sympathetic high priest. He came out of great compassion. He came to the earth to save people from their sins, but he didn't entrust himself to them. He didn't blaspheme God. He wasn't willing to join people in their sin and folly. Instead, he called them to repentance and to trust in him. And so as a Christian, that's the answer. And it's the only answer. So that's the, I'm a pastor. That's what we preach every Sunday morning. That's what we're out trying to share the good news with people. At a societal level, I'm at one basic level trying to simply diagnose the problem. The problem is our feelings. We've made feelings into God. And I want God to be God. I don't want feelings to be God. I want God to be God. Feelings are fickle. Feelings are destructive. They're deceitful. And they will lead us astray to our great ruin. And so let's make God God. And then our feelings get to be feelings. And in that sense, they're great. They're good. They're part of God's design for us as human beings.
Well, very interesting, Dr. Joe Rigney. Thank you so much for being here. The book is The Sin of Empathy, Compassion, and Its Counterfeits. We do have the link down below to grab that book. And I'm sure a lot of people who tend to be on the right who watch the show are going to buy the book and give it to their leftist woke family members and friends. Be like, read this. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. Is there anywhere else where people can, we do have the link down below to the book. Is there anywhere else you'd like them to go to check out your
Yeah, so
work?
I'm on Twitter at Joe_Rigney, or X, I guess, as we call it these days. And then I teach at New St. Andrews College. So those would be the two places where you can find me.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson Show, which has a new show time. Catch the full Kim Iverson Show, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. Head to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.